All right, let's set the stage. Imagine a ritual so sacred it took an entire day to complete. We're not talking about a state affair or a religious ceremony. We're talking about washing one woman's hair. A concoction of raw eggs and French cognac was massaged for hours into ankle-length hair, a process so delicate that the hairdresser was forbidden from wearing rings for fear of snagging a single strand. This wasn't just a beauty routine. This was worship. And the goddess was Empress Elisabeth of Austria. To the world, she was simply Sisi, a living legend. Arguably the most beautiful woman in Europe whose face could launch 1,000 ships or at least make a few archdukes walk into walls. Her impossibly tiny waist and flawless style defined an era. She was for all intents and purposes the 19th century's first global superstar. But what if that celebrated beauty wasn't a gift, but a curse? What if behind the perfect portraits and adoring crowds, this woman was trapped in a gilded hell of her own making, fighting a battle no one could see? What dark secret was she hiding behind that famous 19-inch waist and a pained smile? Welcome to cursed chambers, where we peel back the gold plating to reveal the scars underneath. To understand what happened to Sisi, we first have to meet the woman who held the keys to her cage, her formidable mother-in-law. Then we'll uncover the shocking, obsessive lengths Sisi went to in her quest for perfection. A regimen that was less about beauty and more about, well, you know it. All right. So at the end of our last part, I left you with a question. Who could possibly have pushed our beautiful Empress down such a dark, obsessive path? And I pointed a finger at one person in particular, her mother-in-law. But before we meet the woman who would become Sisi's personal warden, you have to understand the world she commanded. You have to understand the stage where this entire tragedy was set. Because Sisi wasn't just married to a man, you see. She was married into an institution, an empire. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, to be precise. Now that sounds very grand, doesn't it? But in the middle of the 19th century, it was less of a mighty unified empire and more of a sprawling, creaking, multi-ethnic patchwork quilt of a country that was perpetually one sneeze away from falling apart. It was a chaotic jumble of Austrians, Hungarians, Czechs, Poles, Slovaks, Croats, and a dozen other nationalities who, for the most part, didn't particularly like each other, all held together by the sheer stubborn will of one single family. And at the heart of it all were the Habsburgs. Now, if you've been with the channel for a while, you might remember our little chat about another Habsburg, a certain Spanish king whose family tree looked less like a tree and more like a Christmas wreath. Yes, that family. The one that turned selective breeding into a high-stakes, multi-century art form, while our 19th century Austrian Habsburgs weren't quite so intertwined. Let's say they had inherited something just as potent and in some ways just as damaging, a pathological obsession with tradition, with image, and with absolute soul-crushing control. And the primary tool of that control was something called the Spanish court etiquette. This wasn't just a set of polite rules. Oh no, this was a software program for human interaction, and it hadn't been updated in 300 years. It was a suffocating, invisible web of protocol that dictated every single moment of life within the Hofburg Palace in Vienna. There was a rule for how you bowed, a rule for how you addressed someone, a rule for who was allowed to speak to whom and in what order. There was a rule for who could sit in the presence of the Empress and who had to stand. There was even a rule for who was allowed to hand her a pair of gloves, a process that could involve a chain of several ladies-in-waiting, like a bizarre aristocratic assembly line. It was designed to do one thing: to elevate the royal family into something otherworldly, something not quite human, to create a chasm between them and everyone else. It was meant to inspire awe, but what it really created was a profound and terrible isolation. Think of the strictest, most humorless, most judgmental boarding school you can possibly imagine. The kind where your tie has to be perfectly straight, your shoes must be polished to a mirror shine, and you can get detention for breathing too loudly. Now imagine you have to live there for the rest of your life. And imagine the headmistress is not only your aunt, but also your mother-in-law, and she watches your every move, every single move. That was Sisi's new reality. That was the gilded cage she was thrown into. And now, let's meet the inhabitants of this magnificent prison. First, our protagonist, Elisabeth herself. Before she was Sisi the icon, she was just Elisabeth, a shy, sensitive, and profoundly free-spirited girl from a minor branch of Bavarian royalty. She grew up in the countryside at a charmingly informal castle called Possenhofen. She spent her childhood writing poetry, riding horses, often bareback, and hiking in the woods. She grew up with dirt under her fingernails and wind in her hair. She was a creature of nature, of emotion, of freedom. She was in every conceivable way the absolute worst candidate for a life in the Habsburg court. But at the age of just 15, fate and a very determined mother had other plans for her. Next, we have the man she married, the Emperor Franz Joseph I. It's easy to paint Franz Joseph as a villain in this story, but that's too simple. He wasn't cruel. He was just a Habsburg. He was a man who had been buried alive by his own crown from a young age. His entire existence was a monument to duty. His workday began before dawn, often at 4 in the morning, and was filled with an endless, grinding mountain of paperwork. He was the bureaucrat-in-chief of a dying empire. He genuinely loved his beautiful young wife. He was utterly captivated by her, but he simply did not know what to do with her. He didn't understand her moods, her poetry, her desperate need for freedom. To him, emotion was a distraction from duty. He saw a beautiful, perfect clockwork doll that had suddenly started to run incorrectly, and he had absolutely no idea how to fix it. His solution most of the time was to simply retreat back to his desk and leave her to the care, or rather, the control of his mother. And that brings us to our antagonist, the master architect of this gilded prison, Archduchess Sophie. Sophie was Sisi's aunt and her mother-in-law, and she was without a doubt the most powerful woman at court. She was formidable, intelligent, and utterly ruthless in her devotion to the dynasty. In her mind, she wasn't being cruel. She was being practical. She was the CEO of Habsburg Incorporated, and Sisi was the beautiful but wildly unpredictable new hire who refused to read the company handbook. Sophie had seen the empire nearly collapse in the revolutions of 1848. She believed that the only thing holding it together was tradition, discipline, and an iron will. She saw Sisi's free spirit not as charming, but as dangerous. She saw her emotional nature not as endearing, but as a weakness that could threaten the stability of the monarchy. She famously referred to Sisi as our silly young goose. And she took it upon herself to break this young girl and reforge her into a proper Habsburg empress. Control was her weapon, and she wielded it with terrifying precision. So let's recap. You have a free-spirited, sensitive, 15-year-old girl who loves poetry and riding horses. You marry her off to a walking, talking symbol of imperial duty who works 18 hours a day. And you put her under the absolute control of a mother-in-law who sees emotion as a form of treason. You drop this girl, this wild bird, into the most suffocating, rigid, and psychologically crushing court in all of Europe. What do you think is going to happen? A spirit like that doesn't just break. It doesn't just surrender. It finds a way to fight back. It finds a way to rebel. But in a world where every word is monitored and every action is judged, how do you possibly stage a rebellion? You turn the battlefield inward. You make your own body the weapon, the shield, and the canvas for your silent scream. The story of how the happy girl from Bavaria died and the tragic Empress of Sorrow was born. That's coming up right after this. At the end of our last section, we left our young empress, a wild bird trapped in a gilded cage ruled by an iron-willed mother-in-law. I said she was about to stage a rebellion. But this rebellion wasn't a grand political maneuver fought with armies and treaties. It was something far more intimate, far more personal, and in many ways, far more destructive. This is the story of that transformation. It's a tragedy really in 3 acts, the story of how Elisabeth, the hopeful girl from Bavaria, died, so that Sisi, the sorrowful icon, could be born. Act 1, the fatal wound. It all started, as these stories so often do, with the promise of a fairy tale. At just 16 years old, Elizabeth was married to the most powerful young monarch in Europe. She was now the Empress of Austria. Imagine the whirlwind, the glamour, the sheer intoxicating shock of it all. But the fairy tale very quickly revealed itself to be a horror story. The culture of the Vienna court was, to put it mildly, a shock to her system. It was like taking a wildflower and trying to plant it in a block of cold, unforgiving concrete. But the real breaking point, the wound from which she would never truly recover, came with motherhood. In 1855, Sisi gave birth to her first child, a daughter named Sophie. This should have been a moment of triumph and joy, a moment for her to finally claim a real, tangible role in her new life. Instead, it was the moment her powerlessness was made brutally, painfully clear. Almost immediately after the birth, her mother-in-law, the Archduchess Sophie, essentially walked into the nursery, took the baby, and said in so many words, "Thank you. We'll take it from here." The Archduchess, in her infinite wisdom, had decided that a silly young goose of 16 was completely unfit to raise a future Habsburg. So the child was moved to a separate wing of the palace under the direct care of the Archduchess. If Sisi wanted to see her own daughter, she had to formally request a visit. She was a mother, but only in title. Then tragedy compounded the cruelty. 2 years later, while on a trip to Hungary, that Sisi herself had insisted on, both her young daughters fell ill. Her eldest, little Sophie, died in her arms. The grief was immense. But for Sisi, it was a grief laced with a terrible, corrosive poison, the poison of guilt. And you can be certain that the court, and especially her mother-in-law, did nothing to relieve her of that burden. The unspoken message was clear. This was her fault. When her next children were born, including the long-awaited male heir, Crown Prince Rudolph, the pattern was repeated. The nurseries were controlled by the Archduchess. Sisi's one true biological purpose, according to the court, was to produce an heir. And once she had successfully performed that function, she was, in their eyes, largely redundant. Stripped of her role as a mother, and with a husband too absorbed in his work to offer any real comfort, Elizabeth was utterly alone. The girl was broken. Act 2. The birth of Sisi. So what happens when you're stripped of every role you thought you had, when you feel like a ghost in your own life? You look for something, anything, that you can control. And Elizabeth, looking in the mirror, found her answer. She had her face. She had her figure. She had her magnificent hair. And in a court that prized image above all else, she had a revelation. This wasn't just vanity. This was power. This was the moment Elizabeth the girl began to fade, and Sisi, the icon, began to emerge. It was as if she made a conscious decision, a defiant choice, right in the heart of her despair. She seemed to say, "All right, if you are going to treat me like a beautiful object, then I will become the most beautiful, most perfect, most untouchable object you have ever laid eyes on." Her behavior began to shift. She became meticulous, obsessive about her appearance. She poured her formidable energy not into statecraft, but into the cultivation of her own myth. And it worked. Her beauty became legendary across Europe. It gave her leverage. It gave her an identity that no one, not even her mother-in-law, could take from her. Who was going to argue with a living work of art? Her beauty became her shield, her excuse, and in a strange, sad way, her only true weapon. She couldn't rule the empire, but she could rule the hearts and minds of those who saw her. She had found her power, but the price of that power would be her own soul. Act 3. The Endless Flight. With this newfound power, Sisi discovered a new tool, the art of the medical excuse. Suddenly, she began to suffer from a series of ailments, a persistent, hacking cough, terrible bouts of anxiety, fainting spells. But these were very particular illnesses. They only ever seemed to flare up when she was in the suffocating atmosphere of Vienna. Miraculously, her symptoms would often vanish the moment her imperial train crossed the border into a land with fresher air and fewer overbearing relatives. This was her ticket to freedom. Her health became the one thing the court could not argue with. So she began to travel, and travel, and travel. She fled to the warm island of Madeira. She built a magnificent palace in Corfu, a marble temple called the Achillean, dedicated to the Greek hero Achilles, another tragic figure blessed with strength but cursed by a single vulnerability. She traveled to England and Ireland not for diplomacy, but for the brutal, exhilarating fox hunts, where she proved to be a fearless and brilliant horsewoman. She wasn't a tourist, she was an escape artist. She was running. But the more she ran from the court, the more she ran from her duties, the more she ran from her husband, the more she ran into the arms of her own obsessions. Free from the judgmental eyes of Vienna, her private rituals intensified. Her days were no longer structured by courtly duties, but by her own punishing schedule, a schedule that revolved entirely around preserving the beauty that had become her identity. Her life became a series of grueling 6-hour hikes that left her ladies-in-waiting weeping with exhaustion. It became hours upon hours of obsessive gymnastic routines on the equipment she had installed in all of her private chambers. And it became a life defined by a near-constant, gnawing hunger. Eventually, the obsession consumed her public persona entirely. The woman who built her power on being seen now refused to be seen at all. In her later years, she would hide her face from the world, concealed behind a collection of leather fans, parasols, and heavy veils. Why? Because the one thing she feared more than the judgment of her mother-in-law was the judgment of time. She would rather disappear from the world entirely than let it see her age. She wanted to be frozen in time, a perfect, ageless myth. So the transformation was complete. The joyful, free-spirited girl from Bavaria was gone for good. In her place was a sad, wandering ghost, haunted and hunted, a prisoner of the very beauty she had once used to set herself free. But how exactly did she do it? We've talked about the why, but the how is where this story moves from tragic to truly bizarre. What were the specific secret and sometimes shocking methods she used to wage this silent war on her own body? The diet, the exercise, the strange and demanding daily rituals. We are about to open the Empress's private files, and the details are more obsessive and more disturbing than you might think. That's next as we enter the chamber. We left our wandering Empress a ghost haunting the palaces of Europe, a prisoner of her own myth. I promised that we would open her private files to see the machinery behind the magic. So welcome to the chamber. Today's investigation is a little different. Our victim and our culprit are in many ways the same person. We're not dissecting a crime committed in the heat of passion, but a compulsion executed with cold, daily precision. We are examining a slow-motion self-destruction, one that was so beautifully disguised as a wellness routine that the world applauded it, even as it was killing her. The easy answer, the one you'll find in the lazy, dusty corners of history, is that Empress Sisi was simply vain. But let me be very clear, vanity doesn't even begin to cover what we are about to discuss. Vanity is wanting to look good for a wedding photo. Vanity is checking your reflection in a shop window. This was something else entirely. This was a full-time, soul-consuming, all-encompassing religion, and Sisi was its one and only true believer. Let's examine the evidence. Exhibit A, the tyranny of hair. Let's start at the top, quite literally with the hair. It was her trademark, her glory, her crown. It was a thick chestnut mane that, when undone, cascaded all the way down to her ankles. And it was a beast that had to be tamed every single day. The daily ritual of brushing, braiding, and pinning this incredible mass of hair took on average 3 hours every morning. For 3 hours, Sisi would sit perfectly still while her personal hairdresser, a woman named Fanny Fay Follick, performed this sacred duty. Fanny's position sounded glamorous, but in reality, it was one of the most high-stress jobs in the entire empire, with absolutely zero room for error. She was forbidden from wearing rings lest one snag a precious strand. She had to have a deep knowledge of, well, hair chemistry, creating complex tonics and treatments like the infamous cognac and egg yolk concoction we mentioned earlier. And here's where it moves from meticulous to pathological. After every 3-hour session, Fanny was required to present all the hairs that had fallen out to the Empress for inspection, usually in a silver bowl. It was a daily reckoning. If there were too many hairs in that bowl, it was seen as a sign of Fanny's failure, and the Empress's famous moodiness would descend. So Fanny, a clever and profoundly stressed-out woman, reportedly developed a trick for survival. She kept a small piece of adhesive tape hidden in the pocket of her apron. Throughout the session, she would secretly press fallen hairs onto the tape, effectively hiding the evidence of any excess shedding. She had to lie to her Empress every single day just to keep her job over a few split ends. The all-day washing ceremony, which happened about every 3 weeks, would paralyze her entire schedule. The empire could wait. Foreign dignitaries could wait. Her own husband could wait. The hair could not. It was so heavy when wet that she would walk back and forth for hours to dry it, and so precious that she was consumed with anxiety about it. This wasn't a feature, it was her master. Exhibit B, the religion of starvation. But if her hair was her crown, her waistline was her cathedral, and she was its most devout and most suffering worshiper. From a young age, her goal was to maintain a waist measurement of 19.5 inches. For a little bit of modern perspective, that is smaller than the neck size of most professional linebackers. It is an almost inhuman dimension achieved through 2 relentless allies, the corset and starvation. The process of tight lacing was a daily ordeal that could take up to an hour, where a corset was cinched with such force that it could and did rearrange a woman's internal geography. It was a way to physically sculpt the body into an unnatural ideal. But the corset was only half the battle. The true war was waged on her plate. Her diets were the stuff of legend, and not in a good way. Sometimes her entire caloric intake for a day would consist of nothing but the pressed juice from several pounds of raw beefsteak, a ghastly bloody broth she would sip. Other days it might be just 6 glasses of milk. Or, when she was feeling particularly wild and indulgent, perhaps a couple of raw eggs mixed with salt. She was famous for her adoration of candied violets, but would often just have one as a tiny treat. For years, she refused to eat in front of anyone, including her own family, because she was so ashamed of the act of eating itself. And to monitor all of this, she traveled everywhere with her own personal weighing scale. It was the first thing she looked at in the morning, and the last thing she thought about at night. Its judgment dictated her entire day. A single pound over her target weight of roughly 110 pounds or 50 kilograms would trigger an immediate fasting day, or a hunger cure to punish her body back into submission. Exhibit C, the fanaticism of fitness. Now you might think that a person living on beef juice and air wouldn't have much energy, and you would be profoundly wrong. Cece channeled her starvation-fueled nervous energy into a relentless, almost frightening exercise regimen. She was a true pioneer of the home gym. In her opulent royal apartments in Vienna, right next to the priceless tapestries and gilded furniture, she had gymnastic rings, a pommel horse, and a set of dumbbells installed. She would spend hours each morning on these, toning her body with a discipline that would put a modern athlete to shame. But her true passion was walking, or rather forced marching. Her favorite activity was to walk for 6, 7, sometimes 8 hours a day at a blistering, relentless pace. Her ladies-in-waiting, who were chosen for their noble birth and not for their athletic prowess, were expected to keep up. It was a form of torture for them. They would be left struggling, sometimes weeping, miles behind her. There are numerous accounts of her simply walking her companions into the ground and then coolly sending a carriage back to pick them up hours later, as if she'd just been for a light stroll. So when we lay out all the evidence, what do we see? This isn't vanity. This is pathology. This is a classic textbook presentation of what we would today call severe anorexia nervosa and body dysmorphic disorder. This was a woman at war with herself. Every calorie was an enemy soldier to be vanquished. Every inch on the measuring tape was a battle won or lost. Every workout was a desperate defense against an enemy only she could see in the mirror, the terrifying phantom of imperfection. And so we find our cursed chamber. It had no walls. It had no locks. It was her own beautiful, celebrated skin. Her body, the object of a continent's admiration, became her most intimate and inescapable prison. Her beauty wasn't a gift from God. It was an autoimmune disease, a condition where the soul begins to attack its own vessel in a desperate, unending quest to perfect it. A life lived with this level of intensity, this level of inner turmoil, is a tightrope walk over a canyon. It cannot last forever. Cece spent her entire life trying to control every single aspect of her body, trying to shield it from the ravages of time and the slightest imperfection. But she never saw the real danger coming. A danger that had nothing to do with her diet or her exercise or the number on a scale. A danger that was waiting for her, not in a palace, but on a peaceful, sunlit lakeside promenade. The brutal, the senseless, and the deeply ironic end to her story is coming up in our final part. We left Empress Cece on a tightrope walking a razor's edge between perfection and self-destruction. She had spent a lifetime and an unimaginable amount of energy trying to control every single variable fortifying her body against the inevitable attacks of time and imperfection. She built a fortress around herself, a fortress of ritual and routine. But history, as we know all too well here, has a cruel and profound sense of irony. The final fatal blow wasn't a slow decay from within. It didn't come from a faulty weighing scale or a single gray hair or a mouthful of food. It came from a place she never saw coming on a day she thought was just another day on the run. This is the final echo of her story. The date is September 10th, 1898. The place is Geneva, Switzerland, a neutral ground, a place of peace. Cece, now 60 years old, is staying at a hotel on the shore of Lake Geneva. She is, as was her custom, traveling incognito under the name Countess of Hohenems. Anonymity was one of the few luxuries she allowed herself. She had in fact dismissed her police protection for the day, annoyed by their constant presence. She just wanted to take a walk with her lady-in-waiting Countess Stare to catch the steamship that would take them across the lake. It was a beautiful, peaceful afternoon. She was, for a fleeting moment, just another well-dressed woman on a lakeside promenade. But she wasn't, and someone was watching. His name was Luigi Luciani. He was a young Italian anarchist, a man full of rage against the aristocrats, against the royals, against a system that he felt had cast him aside. He had come to Geneva with a singular purpose: to make a name for himself by assassinating a royal. Any royal would do. His original target, as it happens, was the French pretender to the throne, the Prince d'Orléans. But the prince, conveniently for him, had changed his travel plans at the last minute. Luciani was frustrated. He was about to leave when he read in a local newspaper that the celebrated Empress of Austria was in town. He had found a new target, a target of convenience. As Cece and her lady-in-waiting walked towards the pier, Luciani approached. He didn't run at her shouting slogans. He simply appeared to stumble. In a single swift motion, he bumped into the Empress and struck her in the chest. It was over in a second. To the Countess, it looked as though he had simply tried to snatch the Empress's watch. Cece, shocked, fell to the ground, but with the help of her companion and a passerby, she stood up, straightened her clothes, and insisted she was fine. She was corseted so tightly, her body was such a rigid, disciplined machine that she didn't even feel the wound. The corset, the very instrument of her lifelong self-imprisonment. The armor she wore against her own body actually held the wound together for a few precious minutes, preventing a rush of blood and hiding the severity of the injury. In a final twisted act of service, her prison almost saved her life. She walked on another 100 yards or so onto the gangplank of the steamship. It was only then, once she was on board, that she finally collapsed. Her last words were reportedly, "What has happened to me?" They carried her back to the hotel. They cut open her complicated black dress and they finally cut away the corset. It was only then that they saw it. A tiny, almost insignificant puncture wound over her heart. Luciani hadn't used a dagger or a knife. He had used a cheap, crude 4-inch industrial file, a stiletto he had sharpened to a deadly point. It had pierced her lung and her heart. By the time they realized what had happened, it was far, far too late. The Empress was dead. The irony is almost too much to bear. The most famous woman in Europe, who had spent decades becoming invisible, was murdered by a man who at that moment didn't even know for certain who she was. He just saw a symbol of the class he hated, and he struck. The woman who obsessed over every gram on the scale, every millimeter on the measuring tape, was killed by a random act of political violence that she had absolutely no control over. Her life was a monument to meticulous, painful control. Her death was a testament to senseless, brutal chaos. When her husband, the Emperor Franz Joseph, was told the news, the stoic, duty-bound man reportedly broke down in private. His first words were, "You will never know how much I loved this woman." And so we must ask our final question in the chamber. When we close the file on Empress Elisabeth of Austria, what is our final verdict? Was she a shallow, silly, vain woman? Absolutely not. To say so is to do her a profound injustice. She was a profoundly modern soul struggling with profoundly modern problems, trapped in a medieval system. She was a woman suffering from what we would now instantly recognize as severe diagnosable mental health conditions, from anorexia and body dysmorphia to crippling depression and agoraphobia. She lived in an age that had no names for these afflictions, let alone any sympathy for them. Her obsessive habits, her bizarre rituals, her endless flight. These were not choices, they were symptoms. They were the desperate coping mechanisms of a brilliant, sensitive mind that was breaking under an unbearable weight. But why does her story still haunt us? Why are we still talking about her over a century after her death? Because if you look closely, Cece's cursed chamber is all around us. She was the original influencer, a woman who spent her life curating a perfect, flawless public image while her inner world was crumbling to dust. She filtered her life long before we had filters on our phones. She showed the world only the beautiful highlights, the magnificent hair, the perfect gowns, the poetic travels, while hiding the starvation, the anxiety, the desperate workouts, and the profound, crushing loneliness. Does that sound familiar? Her story is a timeless and heartbreaking cautionary tale about the tyranny of the perfect image. It's about the pressure we put on public figures, especially women, to be inhumanly flawless, and the damage it does when their messy, complicated humanity is erased in favor of a simple, beautiful icon. Cece wasn't a goddess. She wasn't a fairy queen. She was a human being, and she was crushed under the weight of her own legend. In the end, the beautiful Empress of Austria, the Queen of Hungary, was not defeated by a rival empire or a political plot, or even finally by her own inner demons. She was defeated by a 10-cent industrial file in the hands of a lost and angry man who was simply in the right place at the wrong time. A senseless end to a life lived with such painful, meticulous control, and that perhaps is the most cursed chamber's tragedy of all. So I leave you with a final question. What do you think? Was Cece's true prison the rigid Vienna court that controlled her actions, or her own mind that controlled her body? Let me know in the comments below. I'm genuinely curious to read your thoughts. Thank you for joining us once again in the chamber. If you believe history is full of stories that deserve a second look, and that the past is never truly past, make sure you subscribe and ring that notification bell so you don't miss our next investigation. Until then, remember that behind every perfect portrait, there's always a story waiting to be told.